Welcome to Actuary Voices, the podcast from the American Academy of Actuaries. I'm your host, David Nolan. Today, I'm talking with Maria Kirilenko and Koren Holden, two of the authors of a new issue brief released by the Academy's Pension Committee, Valuing Gender Expansive Data. Maria, Koren, welcome to Actuary Voices. What I'd like to do first perhaps is hear from you both, where you're from, your involvement with the Academy, what you love or otherwise about being an actuary, and we'll take it from there. Koren, do you want to start?
Sure. Just to make it official, I am Koren Holden, and I am so pleased to be invited on your podcast today with Maria. I'm the senior actuary at the Public Employees Retirement Association of Colorado, or less formally known as Colorado PARA. I currently serve as a volunteer on the Academy's Public Plans Committee. As far as personal background, I'm a farm girl, originally from a small town in southeastern South Dakota. I attended the University of Nebraska and attained my degree in mathematics and political science, oddly enough, with a minor in computer science. Although my university was one of the few in the nation at the time that offered a degree in actuarial science, coming from such a small town, I didn't hear about the profession until my junior year from a fellow math student who was majoring in that degree. So I decided to move forward with my math degree at the time so I could get through in 4 years. And then I would start taking exams and see if it's something I wanted to do.
Sounds great. I'm going to date this, but the University of Nebraska made international news this week with a world record women's sporting event attendance at a women's volleyball tournament.
90,000.
92,000. Yep, that was a lot.
Oh, 92,000. Okay.
Yeah, the old record was a game in Spain when Barcelona were involved. It was 91,000 and change, and this went over 92. So very impressive. Volleyball's obviously big.
I have to say that although I love Nebraska football when I was there, it's fallen off a little bit since I attended way back in the dark ages. And I'm happy to say that our stadium was finally used for something productive.
Okay, we'll leave that one there. Maria, how about you? Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Hi, so I'm Maria Kirilenko. My pronouns are she or they, and I am a vice president and actuary at Siegel. I mostly work on multi-employer funds, but in the course of my career, I've touched retiree health funds, touched public sector plans, single employer plans, and I've been volunteering with the Academy on the Pension Committee for about 2 years now, and have worked on just a couple of projects during this time, of which this paper is the first to be published.
Congratulations. That's great.
Thank you. Thank you. And I should say, I wouldn't call us the lead authors on this paper. We worked with another two actuaries on this, and it was very much a collaborative effort with all of us contributing. We're just, the ones who got sucked into doing doing these events. But it is very exciting to be here and have the opportunity to talk more about this publication, which I think is very important.
Agreed. Okay, well, look, before we jump in and talk about the issue brief, Maria, perhaps I'll start with you. What do you find most enjoyable about your work as an actuary in general?
Yeah, absolutely. So I didn't mention how I kind of started out in actuarial science, but it was very much a pragmatic decision. I knew I wanted to do applied maths, and my parents suggested that I look at the kinds of jobs there are out there in applied mathematics. And I think I literally sat down and looked at some best job lists, like jobs with the highest satisfaction, and actuary is consistently in the top 3. So I just did that. And then it clicked. And I never really expected to find that much, as much personal fulfillment as I actually got. As a multi-employer actuary in particular, I really feel honored to work in the interest of union members and participants in the labor movement. And I just always think about participants first. That is I really do it for them, and benefit security is very much something that is important to me. In the course of my career, I started my career in 2006, and we were very quickly hitting The financial crisis of 2008, a lot of the plans that I happened to work on were in very dire straits. And just in the past few years have started really emerging from what we call critical status in the multi-employer world. And it's just really been a privilege to think that I have shaped or helped shape the really challenging decisions that plans have made. Have had to make, benefit reductions, really, belt tightening and things like that. And these funds now are in a position to improve benefits and so on. And it's just really gratifying to, over the course of my career, have watched this happen. One of my things that I'm proud of the most is a plan that I work on that received special financial assistance just this month. The Prior to the passage of the American Rescue Plan Act, just this month, those participants of that plan would have had their benefit cut to the PBGC level. But because of the special financial assistance application that my team and I put together, the fund received an injection of money, and these participants now have retirement security, and that was just wonderful. You can hear I'm just being emotional right now because I do think it's so important.
It is absolutely phenomenal when you can see your work having a real impact on real people in the real world. Yes, absolutely. Well, congratulations. That's great news.
It's amazing. I'd have to say I'm very much in parallel with Maria. That the gratification I receive from my career choice and my job on a day-to-day basis never ceases to amaze me. And I've told my daughters that, I can only hope you find a profession or a career or vocation that is just satisfying to you, where you actually want to go to work in the morning or stay home and work from your desk at home, however that goes, that you want to tackle the day's job and do a good job. My background was, I kind of got into the profession thinking I'm going to check this out and see if I like it. So when I was in a consulting actuary, when I first started in the business, when I was a young consultant, I really enjoyed the programming challenges. I loved the fact that we got to program the benefits into a very elaborate system. And so my, computer skills behind me, that was ideal at the time. And then as I evolved into an actual consulting actuary, I just loved meeting with my clients and listening to their issues and problems and challenges and trying to help them work through those, just as Maria is describing there. Um, uh, so working for Colorado Para, I work not only as a liaison with the external service provider that the board chooses. We have external actuaries that do the bulk of all the work. But I'm there to ensure quality and timely delivery of the work product. I also act as an internal resource to Para's executive team and the board. So it's like being a consultant, but dedicated to only one client. So it's ideal. And I hope that Para and their board feel my service to them has been helpful as we tackle significant pension reform via legislation and, throughout my time at Para.
Right. Well, I'm sure the people of Colorado are very grateful for the work you do. Why don't we move on now to the issue brief that helped author the Valuing Gender Expansive Data. And perhaps we could start by discussing what kind of problem you were trying to solve when you set about writing this. Maria, do you want to start with that?
Sure, absolutely. I would say that we wanted to start a conversation first and foremost, and perhaps spur other people to discuss this topic more and research new approaches to handling gender expensive data. We'll probably talk about those definitions later, but it's essentially data that's not just locked into that male-female binary that is so fundamental to traditional actuarial science, so that we as a profession aren't taken by surprise when, and I think it's when, not if, we start getting more significant amounts of gender expansive data that's just not just coded male, female, but has a variety of other fields.
Okay, thanks. And Koren, Maria mentioned defining some terms there. So do you want to explain when we talk about sex and gender, do you want to tell us how you see them as being different?
Well, from an actuarial point of view, I would say that the term sex to us generally means the sex status assigned at birth based on child's visible sex organ. The term gender came to be used, I think, a lot during the 80s and 90s as the computer usage picked up as a synonym for the term sex, as a gentler, softer word that wouldn't get, trapped in computer searches, if you will. But it was never really an exact synonym. Anyway, the term gender, based on very helpful definitions provided by the National Institutes of Health that are included in an appendix of the paper, broadly, it's a set of socially constructed roles, behaviors, activities, and attributes that given society considers appropriate. So gender, as we define in our paper, is more of the personal concept of self, how the individual is perceived and or refer to themselves, whether that be male, female, both, neither, gender fluid, gender queer, or agender. So first, we as actuaries must understand this relatively new and expanding lexicon. And for this reason, the drafting team, so thank you also Nadine Norloff and Susan Boyle, I included a brief glossary of terms at the end of the issue brief based on the definitions published by the NIH.
Sounds great. So it's an educational document as well as exploring a new topic for the Academy.
Yeah, I would say communication, education, and kind of a call to arms at the end is how I see our paper. And Maria, let me know if you feel differently about that.
Call to arms may be a more violent metaphor than I personally would have chosen, but let's say a conversation starter. And I think when you start a conversation, you need to make sure that you agree on terms and are speaking the same language. So we do feel it's important to define these things. I would also just stress that these definitions are by no means scientific definitions. They are more colloquial or simplified. You could say either way. Sex has so many different, biological characteristics and so on, and it's just sort of not really relevant to how it's being used in day-to-day life. And so in this paper,
I totally understand why it's vitally important that we actuaries use the data that is available. Do you think are the implications for having new forms of data available? Maria, do you want to start with that?
I think the implications are really, we're valuing data. We need to calculate liabilities for funds, and it all starts with the data because that's the source of everything, really. So if we don't understand the data, or even especially if we don't know that we don't understand the data, these things can affect what assumptions we set, what methods we use, and it can affect the results. Something that we talked about, and I think a reaction that we have been getting pretty frequently in talking to colleagues about this paper, is that the percentage of the population that identifies as non-binary or is transgender or basically anything other than cisgender is very small. And that is true, but it's a lot more subtle than that. And the picture is very different when you are actually drilling down into the age ranges and the prevalence of these identities in different age ranges. There have been a couple of recent studies that show that among young people, so that would be, Generation Z, a recent study found that among young people, so Gen Zers and even younger millennials, so even if we're not looking at just at teenagers, but we're looking at adults who are under age 30, we have like up to 5% non-cisgender participants. And I think that starts getting into the range of what you would consider significant from a mathematical standpoint.
I think we also had quite a bit of discussion too. So as Maria pointed out, you have this evolution over time where as these concepts are more socially acceptable, more widely understood, more widely known, I think younger generations will be less likely to identify themselves as in a binary situation. And so for that purpose, we use the title of the paper encompasses this term gender expansive data. And sorry, I didn't mention that earlier, but we had a discussion that missing data should also kind of be, as far as the purposes of our paper, would be lumped into this gender expansive data too, because we don't know if somebody just missed the question or perhaps they chose not to respond because maybe the response is only allowed for a binary option. So when we're discussing gender expansive data, in our own definition in the paper, we included missing or non-binary data. So I wanted to clarify that. But we also had a discussion that perhaps as time goes on, younger generations might not even want to share that information, even if they consider themselves binary, or there's an option on the form that specifically describes how they see themselves. They still might choose to not respond. And so I think as actuaries, we have to think of that possibility and that likelihood going forward in the world that we're living in with this growing vernacular and understanding of sex versus gender versus identity, etc.
Let me take a moment to remind listeners that you're listening to Actuary Voices, a podcast from the American Academy of Actuaries. On this podcast, we talk to Academy volunteers and leaders about how they became actuaries and what inspires them about their work, both professionally and as an Academy volunteer. Please subscribe to Actuary Voices on your preferred podcast platform. And now, back to the latest episode, where I'm talking to Maria Kirilenko and Koren Holden, two authors of a new issue brief entitled Valuing Gender Expansive Data. And you wrote the paper, obviously, from the perspective of pension actuaries. And I'm wondering, did you think about or look at whether people who say their gender is different than their sex assigned at birth have different health outcomes, and particularly cisgendered people, or that would impact life expectancy and so on?
I can take this one. So there are certainly studies that suggest this. Personally, and we as a group agreed that we would be hesitant to cite this as a big concern for pension funding, in particular because in the US, at least, pension plan participants are a very specific segment of the total US population. And there are a lot of suggestions in the data on life expectancies, health outcomes, mortality, etc. There are suggestions that the reason for these, more poor outcomes is lack of societal supports, transphobia, violence. So a lot of really tragic stuff. It is, I think, possible to speculate that a transgender or non-binary person who is a participant in the pension fund is not necessarily experiencing those outcomes to the same extent. This is purely speculative from my point of view, but the point I'm trying to make is that until I see a study of pension plan participants that looks at different outcomes for transgender or non-binary people versus cisgender people, I wouldn't really do anything differently to reflect mortality for non-binary plan participants.
We also discussed at what point might there be enough data to even make the outcomes or make the research credible. So credibility was also a discussion point as well.
Sure. And given that point, how should actuaries approach this topic with plan administrators? Koren, do you want to start with that?
Yeah, thank you. I think the first step is simply setting up a meeting. If this has not already been done by this point, I think it's imperative that actuaries set up meetings with their clients to explore and perhaps map out a plan of study and to look at such items as what does the data look like that the employer or administration team is currently collecting? What is the verbiage used on all intake and administrative forms? Is the term sex or gender used? Is the verbiage consistent across all forms? Are data collection forms unique in their purpose of collecting sex and or gender data? Meaning it might not work the same, or you might not get the same responses if you're putting out forms to collect gender identity, societal data for the firm versus this is the data we're sending to our actuaries. And so answer this, it depends on, the purpose. And are other non-binary options available on the form? And to what frequency are people responding either without a response and or choosing those non-binary options? I mean, all of these things need to be, mapped out and studied.
And Maria, for the multi-employer side, are there different approaches?
Yeah, I would say it's pretty different. What's interesting to me is the reason I first came up with the idea for this paper is that a multi-employer plan administrator asked me, hey, what do you do in these situations if data is provided like that? And my answer was, I don't know. This is what I think I'd do if I receive data like this. My answer also was, we don't need you to just provide male female data. We'll figure something out. Like the data is what it is. With multi-employer funds, especially ones that include potentially thousands of employers, there's basically no point having a conversation about data collection. In terms of like participant demographic data, just because everyone is doing their own thing. Like all of the employers are doing their own thing. They might choose not to report the data. In some cases, they're really, really small shops. So I think that the approach would really be very individual, depending on the plan. You might decide that this data is just generally not very reliable, and we do that for like other types of data too. The multi-employer world, data is just rife with errors. And the best we can do is look at the experience and try to select our assumptions in a way that fits them best. That would probably be my approach with multi-employer funds. Like, I guess, decide if you need to, or if you would do anything differently if you learned something that's contrary to your assumptions, because in many cases, maybe you wouldn't. So I think it's just important to be aware and also to kind of think ahead.
And Koren, do we have any best practices in place, or are they forthcoming?
Well, that is an interesting question, and it might be perhaps a bit early in the game. There are some options that we provide in the paper under the using sex gender expansive data as far as things that can be done now. So looking at the most prevalent sex gender, or mapping a portion of like missing data or non-binary data to male or female status. And the paper goes on with about 3 or 4 more suggestions. So there are suggestions in the paper on how to deal with issues that you're coming up against now. But I'd say that anybody at this point in the game that has actually taken a deep dive on those, looking at their administrative forms, looking at the collection of data, how it's collected, and having a conversation with their actuaries on how best to approach this. They are ahead of the game, and they might be considered best practices to date. But both Maria and I probably, and the other people involved, feel that more research and study needs to be done.
Where do you think the work is going in the future? What do you think in the short and medium term that actuaries, whether they are with the academy and working in public policy or for private employers or otherwise, how should they be approaching this issue?
So we suggest a few ideas in the issue brief for their areas of study and research. And some of these ideas get into mortality table construction. We know that gender traditionally has been a very, very strong differentiator of mortality, but there are other ways. We know that gender has long been a strong differentiator of mortality, but there are other factors and other characteristics that are as well. For example, color, income, industry. But the use of these tables is also differentiated by sex and gender. So, for example, you have a blue collar mortality table, but you have a male blue collar and a female blue collar table. It would be interesting to see additional research that would identify some other criteria that perhaps could be used in lieu of sex or gender. So that's one idea. Then, of course, there's also mortality studies of populations that are not identifying as cisgender. That certainly is something that's sort of already being done by various NGOs, but hasn't been done, like I mentioned much earlier, in the pension realm. So that could be something, that could be a direction that we could go in the future. Obviously, it would have to be done with great care and respect and so on, but that's certainly one idea. Koren, do you want to add anything?
Well, one other item we talked about, in addition to, perhaps developing or continuing development of mortality tables based on, industry, geography, income levels, color, like you had referred to, was the kind of the flip side issue of many of the valuation systems are built to handle this binary approach at mortality. So in addition to the possibility of expanding the mortality tables themselves into different or various differentiators, or maybe multiple differentiators, we'll also have the challenge of building new systems that can handle different and or multiple differentiators in the mortality tables applied to develop the liability. So that was another topic of discussion, and we mentioned it in the paper at the end.
Great. Well, I want to thank you for doing this work. You and the rest of the committee have broken new ground for us. I'm sure it won't be the last time, but set a mark that we should be aspiring to on a regular basis. Have you any final comments about the paper?
It's been a joy to be with you both here today to discuss the Valuing Gender Expansive Data issue brief. I'm, like Maria, I'm very excited to have been asked to join the writing team, and I thank the Academy and the Pension Committee for giving us the opportunity to work on the important message.
As a member of not quite the under 30, but still a relatively younger cohort, it's always been challenging to me in my work to just talk about gender as male or female. We talk about opposite sex a lot and so on in, describing mortality assumptions, for example, or spouse age assumptions, spouse gender assumptions, and so on. It has been, like Koren said, a great pleasure to work on something where we might kind of get past this kind of old approach and be a little bit more in step with how the sex and gender are viewed in the broader society.
Sounds good. Thank you. I usually end these podcasts with people giving a plug for volunteering. It's something that we place a lot of emphasis on at the Academy, immense because we know that our volunteers do an immense amount of work. And the two of you have just come through with a really great paper. And I'm hoping you're still feeling warm and fuzzy about being a volunteer. And I was wondering, if you were to say to somebody who was thinking about whether to become a volunteer, what might you say to them? Maria, do you want to start?
Sure, I'll start. Everyone at my company who is an Academy volunteer or a volunteer with any other actuarial society is significantly further along in their career than I am. And I have 17 years of experience. So that kind of gives you an idea of how few young actuaries are participating in this intellectual work, essentially, that is driving the profession forward. So in my brief time with the Academy, I have learned a lot. I have really expanded my outlook, my horizon, and I've had a chance to contribute to the profession as well in my small way. So I would really encourage younger actuaries to look at volunteering, even if it seems intimidating, and for people who are a lot more knowledgeable and more experienced than you, and I'm definitely not going to say smarter because that's a very different thing. I would absolutely encourage every young actuary to think about volunteering.
Thanks. Koren?
I'd say that involved individuals that actively and consistently volunteer, they will all say that it's a bonus, an incredible experience, and the opportunity of volunteerism brings to their career and their life, and they are not wrong. I started volunteering when invited by a couple of my colleagues who are also close friends, and I'm so glad I did. It's more rewarding than anyone can possibly explain. I feel strongly about putting out issue briefs and practice notes and other papers to better communicate on actuarial topics. And I do this, and I feel this is so important because in certain political arenas, I've been up against individuals who are not actuaries, who throw around actuarial terms and concepts and findings that are not correct or on target whatsoever. So the more accurate research and thorough and truly actuarial-based analysis and papers that can be made available, I'd say all the better. So for all of you out there who are not yet volunteering, please come, enrich your career and life, and join us.
Maria, Koren, thank you so much for your time today. It was our first double header with two guests. Thanks for making it so easy. Today, I was speaking with Koren Holden and Maria Kirilenko, two of the authors of a new issue brief released by the Academy's Pension Committee, Valuing Gender Expansive Data. The Academy will be having a webinar on this subject on September 27th. You can register at actuary.org. You can also register for the Academy's annual meeting, Envision Tomorrow, which takes place November 13th and 14th, Omni Shoreham Hotel in Washington, D.C. My name is David Nolan, and I'm the host of Actuary Voices, a podcast from the American Academy of Actuaries. Please visit our website, actuary.org, for a wealth of information about the work that the Academy does. You can follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and LinkedIn as well. And of course, please subscribe to this podcast on your preferred podcast platform.